Everyone wants to live a satisfying life. One of the most significant factors in determining how satisfying our lives are is our values. This is the second in a series of programs I'm doing on values and how our values might impact on our lives. In this series, the focus will be primarily on the following values: money, status, sex, competition, and power. One of the things I aim to do is to discuss some of the possible advantages and disadvantages of greatly valuing those values. And also, I'll be pointing out what so many of the great thinkers in philosophy and literature, psychology and religion have said about those values and about about valuing them a lot or not so much. Also, another question I will attempt to answer, and again with the help of the great thinkers, is what is success? What have famous thinkers said about success? What standards have they used to determine whether their lives were successful or not? And what standards do they suggest we use to determine whether our lives are successful or not? Let me provide a brief review of the last program. I mentioned that a value is that which one considers to be important or desirable. Again, something could be an idea, it could be a product, something that someone considers to be important and desirable. Besides the values I've already mentioned, some other values, for example, are self-discipline, conformity, individuality, being popular, low consumption of material goods, high consumption of material goods. In the last program, my focus was primarily on money, and I spoke again about what some of the great thinkers have said are some of the advantages and disadvantages of greatly valuing money. And I pointed out that there have been people in history who did not value money very much, as well as, of course, many people who have valued money a great deal. In the first category would be people like Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau was a Harvard graduate, but he only worked a regular job for about 2 years of his life. For much of his life, he was a handyman. He only had 2 books published in his life, neither of which made very much money. And Thoreau said this about money. He said, "Man is rich in proportion to the things he can do without." Man is rich in proportion to the things he can do without. Albert Schweitzer I used as another example of a person who did not greatly value money. Schweitzer had a PhD and a medical degree, and for 30 years, as you probably know, he worked in Africa as a medical doctor, treating the poorest of the poor. And of course, another good example of somebody who didn't value money very much would be Mother Teresa. In the other category, people who have valued money a great deal would be people like John D. Rockefeller, who made a fortune in the oil industry, Andrew Carnegie, a steel tycoon, and Donald Trump, whom, as you know, has made a lot of money in the real estate business. I mentioned last week that among the possible advantages of greatly valuing money would be the following. It could result in more freedom and independence. I mentioned that Johnny Carson, the entertainer, Johnny Carson, in an interview many years ago, said that one of the results of him having much money was that he didn't have to worry about money. He said he no longer worried about paying the rent or paying off the mortgage, but he did add that other worries had replaced his money worries. Aristotle pointed out that one of the advantages of having sufficient money is that it could mean one would have leisure time. And he believed leisure time was very important because in our leisure time we can cultivate the mind, something Aristotle attached great importance to. Another possible advantage of greatly valuing money is that if one does accumulate a lot of money, it puts one in a position to help other people. I mentioned last week the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill Gates has given away a lot of money, and a lot of this money is doing a lot of good in the world today. Also, Andrew Carnegie, whom I mentioned before. Carnegie gave away 90% of his wealth before he died. Indeed, in an essay he wrote entitled Wealth, he said that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. Among the possible disadvantages of greatly valuing money, it could, of course, result in tunnel vision, that one could become so involved, absorbed in earning money and accumulating huge sums of money that it could lead to great stress, and one could sacrifice one's health, one's family life, and even one's integrity. In fact, Socrates, on the subject of money and integrity, said this: the more people value money, the less they value virtue. He went on to say, in truth, we may imagine riches and virtue as always balanced in scales against each other. And another possible disadvantage of greatly valuing money is that it could stifle one's self-development. The idea being that one may not cultivate a particular dimension of one's personality because one is so preoccupied in making money. So, for example, the intellectual in oneself may never be cultivated, in that one may not have the time or the energy to read books. Or the music lover, or the craftsman. One can be so busy earning money that one doesn't develop non-career competencies, hobbies, or skills such as carpentry, cooking, etc. And perhaps if one is so absorbed in making money, one might neglect to become a nature lover, when indeed one might have a real interest in nature and a real desire to learn more about nature and to enjoy it. Also last week, I began to focus in on status as a value. And by status, I mean a high ranking in society. And the first question I addressed myself to was the following: why do so many people crave social status? Well, psychologists and sociologists tell us there are a variety of reasons, but among the reasons are the following. And by the way, this particular reason is cited in a book I highly recommend to you, a book called Status Anxiety. It's a current publication by Alain de Botton. Mr. Botton says this about why people want status. He says, we are afflicted with a congenital uncertainty as to our value. He then goes on to say, we are anxious about the place we occupy in the world. And psychiatrist Alfred Adler contended that one of the reasons people seek status is this. Adler contended that all people have inferiority feelings. Some people have deeper feelings than others, more pervasive feelings of inferiority than others, but he believed it was a given that all human beings, to some extent, have feelings of inferiority, and we wish to have status to compensate for those feelings. I mentioned last week that J.D. Salinger, in a famous book called Franny and Zoe, challenges the conventional wisdom concerning status seeking. The lead character in the book is a young lady named Franny. She's going to an Ivy League type college, and she's just resigned from the theater group. And in a very important and poignant point in the story, Salinger has Franny explaining to her boyfriend why she's quit the theater group, why she doesn't want to appear in any more college theater productions. And she says this. Franny says, I'm sick of people who want to impress other people and make a big splash. She goes on to say that she's disgusted at herself for wanting people to applaud her and enjoying the applause. And finally, she says this, and I think this is a great line. She says this, I'm sick of not having the courage to be an absolute nobody. I'm sick of not having the courage to be an absolute nobody. Is this a foolish attitude or a wise attitude? Well, many of the great thinkers, in one way or another, have addressed themselves to Franny's comments. So again, let's find out what many of the famous thinkers have said are some of the advantages and disadvantages of greatly valuing social status. Among the possible advantages, of course, are these. It could result in greater self-respect. If one is admired by other people, again, it could mean more self-esteem. Also, it could be an incentive to work harder. So if one wants social status, for example, one might decide to go to medical school and become a physician. That requires a lot of hard work, of course, but part of the incentive might be not just money and not just the ability to help people, but also social status. And also, it's possible that people in the business world, more than possible, it's likely that some people in the business world who wish to move up in the corporation and perhaps become the CEO of the company they work for will find status seeking an incentive to work harder. And what might be some of the possible disadvantages of greatly valuing status? Well, I think it's fair to say that if one's self-worth and self-concept are tied to a title or a possession, that can be a dangerous way to live. In other words, if one needs a particular job title or a particular kind of home to feel good about oneself, that's a pretty dangerous way to live, in the sense that if one loses that job or one can no longer afford the expensive home, that could mean that one will suffer a great diminution in one's feelings about oneself, one's self-esteem. Also, I think it's fair to say that just because one experiences an increase in one's social status does not mean that one's self-image will improve. Psychiatrists will tell you there are many people who have much social status who are depressed, and indeed some of whom suffer from low self-esteem. Perhaps Marilyn Monroe, one of the most glamorous and sexy women of the 20th century, fit into that category. And maybe former President Nixon as well. Many commentators, and indeed people who knew them well, claim that both Marilyn Monroe and President Nixon, despite their high social status, were both very insecure people. Psychiatrists tell us that there are many men and women of high status who dress elegantly and have expensive possessions, who are very insecure people and who indeed dislike themselves. Therapists will tell you that appearances can be deceiving. Indeed, the famous psychiatrist Carl Jung, in his writings, writes about so many of the high-status people he treated, and the idea that so many of them, despite their high ranking in society, suffered from low self-esteem. So there's no automatic connection between an increase in one's social status and an increase in one's self-respect. Also, another possible advantage of greatly valuing status is that it could restrict one's freedom. That status seeking often is accompanied by a desire to have the approval of other people. The Tao Te Ching, a very famous Chinese book of wisdom, puts it this way: care about other people's approval and you will be their prisoner. It's just interesting that people running for the presidency in the United States have to sacrifice some of their freedom, I think, in the sense that if you're a Bush or a Gore and you have an opportunity, a pretty good opportunity to become president of the United States, you must be very careful about what you say so that you don't alienate large numbers of voters, and equally important, not alienate potential contributors of money to your campaign. Whereas people who are running for the presidency but who feel they have no real shot at winning, in a certain sense, have more freedom to say what they think. People like Ralph Nader, Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot, when they were running for president, I think that because they didn't have a real shot at winning the presidency, really had more freedom to say what they really felt. Whereas Gore and Bush, seeking the power and status of the presidency, among other things, were more restricted in what they could say. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the very famous American essayist, had some very powerful words on the office of presidency of the United States. And about 150 years ago, he wrote this. And by the way, he's not talking about any particular president, and he's not talking about any particular political party. He's talking about the office of the presidency. And here are Ralph Waldo Emerson's own words. The president has paid dearly for his White House. It has commonly cost him all his peace, and the best of his manly attributes. To preserve for a short time so conspicuous an appearance before the world, he is content to eat dust before the real masters who stand erect behind the throne. Pretty powerful words. Again, he's saying the president has paid dearly for his White House. It has cost him his peace and the best of his manly attributes. And also indicates that in order to become president, one must ingratiate oneself to so many people. He uses the expression of the president eating dust before the real masters, again, who stand erect behind the throne. Reverend William Sloane Coffin, on the subject of status, has said this: when you don't care much about money, status, and power, you have more freedom. What might be some of the other disadvantages of greatly valuing status? Well, I think it's fair to say that increased social status will not necessarily lead to greater happiness. I think Shakespeare provides some illumination here, especially his famous play King Lear. King Lear, as you might recall, was a very unhappy man, despite having the status of a king. And why was he so unhappy? Well, his high status was not enough to compensate him for the objectionable behavior of his children and for the fact that he craved the love of many people, including his children, and felt that he was not getting the love that he craved. We also know that high status and being envied often go together, that when one has high status, again, one will probably be envied by many people, and this could put oneself in a dangerous position. People who are often envied are often the targets of other people. And again, here I think Shakespeare provides further illumination, because one of the emotions that he often portrays in his plays is envy. And the fact that so often envy people live a rather dangerous existence. And among the specific plays, I think, which illustrate this idea are Hamlet. Hamlet's father was the king and was killed by Hamlet's uncle, apparently because his uncle wanted the status and power of being king. Julius Caesar had great status. He was murdered. And in Shakespeare's play Macbeth, the king in the play is murdered. So again, one of Shakespeare's ideas, and it's been an idea expressed by many writers, is that when one has high status, one will almost inevitably be envied, and that could put one in a dangerous position. The famous Dutch philosopher Spinoza, in fact, he is the most famous of all Dutch philosophers, he said that people are naturally envious creatures. Spinoza said human nature is such that people resent other people's successes and rejoice at their failures. He went on to say that we are very complicated creatures, we human beings. He said this: we tend to have compassion for those experiencing adversity, but tend to have envy for those experiencing prosperity. Historian Will Durant raises the question: will status improve our friendships? Will status improve our friendships? And here is his response. Durant says this: only the noblest spirits can bear with equanimity the success of their friends. Only the noblest spirits can bear with equanimity the success of their friends. Of course, the fact that one may be envied for having high social status is no reason to avoid having it. Indeed, the fact is that some very high status people are often in a position to do some very valuable things for humanity. So many of the high status people have proved to be great philanthropists, great writers, outstanding doctors, extraordinary lawyers, great scientists and composers have all made valuable contributions to society. Another important question: does increasing one's social status go hand in hand with becoming a more decent person? Gandhi, in his autobiography, said he didn't think so. Here are Gandhi's own words. How heavy is the toll of sins and wrongs that wealth, power, and prestige exact from man. Gandhi went on to say, for what does it benefit a man if his social status is raised when he himself is not raised? And of course, Jesus talked about people gaining the world but losing themselves and losing their souls. Poet, playwright T.S. Eliot put it this way: half of the harm that is done in this world is due to people who want to feel important. He says they are absorbed in the endless struggle to think well of themselves. Thomas Jefferson had some very hard-hitting words about status seekers. Someone once wrote Jefferson a letter asking him for his view of human nature and whether he agreed with the great French thinkers Recevuto and Montaigne, who both believe that the majority of human beings are rogues. Indeed, they said that 14 out of 15 men are rogues. And here was Jefferson's response. Again, and he wrote these words in a letter to a friend. Jefferson said the idea that 14 out of 15 men are rogues, he did not accept. But then he said this, and I'm quoting Thomas Jefferson. But I have always found that rogues would be uppermost, and I do not know that the proportion is too strong for the higher orders and those who contrive to nestle themselves into positions of profit and power. Pretty hard-hitting words from Thomas Jefferson. He's telling us that he suspects that most people who occupy positions of power and profit are rogues. Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, also addressed himself to this question, and Franklin pointed out that so often he knew people who were awarded with high status jobs not because of what they knew, but because of whom they knew. Question: does every society have a kind of affirmative action for some people, but an affirmative action that's not based on race or sex, but rather on who one knows, on networking, for example? I must point out that 19th century American Protestantism often sounded a different note. Many Protestant ministers in the 19th century in the United States said this. They claimed that great wealth and status were likely to be signs of holiness. For example, the Episcopal Bishop of Massachusetts in 1892 said that great riches and goodness usually went together. Here are his own words. Again, the Episcopal Bishop of Massachusetts. In the long run, it is only to the man of morality that wealth comes. Occasionally the wicked prosper, but only occasionally. Goodness is in league with riches. What do you think? I must also point out there was a particular philosophy that gained wide currency in Europe and America in the 19th century, a philosophy known as social Darwinism that preached something similar to what that Protestant minister, Protestant bishop was preaching. And the lead proponent of social Darwinism was an Englishman named Herbert Spencer, who said, in effect, the rich and the high status people are rich and have high status because of their biology. He believed that rich people and high status people have superior genes. Which leads to a significant question. Is being ambitious a good thing? You know that being ambitious and status seeking often go together. Well, the great thinkers essentially say this about being ambitious. They claim there are two ways to be ambitious. One way of being ambitious, the superior way, involves having a social conscience. It means, yes, you want to advance your career and maybe accumulate a lot of money, But you do have a heart. You are concerned with other people. You are concerned with the welfare of other people. So you don't want to advance your status at the expense of other people. Whereas there is another way of being ambitious. And this way does not involve a social conscience. It's entirely selfish, whereby one wants to advance one's status and perhaps one's financial situation, but one has no concern for the welfare of other people. And the idea is the success of these people is often harmful to society. St. Augustine, by the way, pointed out that there are really two standards by which to determine, there are really two standards one can use to determine high status. One standard, of course, is the standard that's usually used, I think, and that is we judge a person's status by the amount of money they have, their possessions, and their occupations. But Augustine said this. Augustine said there is another standard one can employ, and this is a standard I think usually, in fact I think always, used by very spiritual people. They claim that we should judge a person's status by the quality of their hearts. Indeed, the Dalai Lama has said this. The Dalai Lama has said that the more compassionate, kind, and gentle a person, the more he or she should be respected. I'll say that again. The more compassionate, kind, and gentle a person, the more he or she should be respected. What do you think about that? Let me close with a quotation from the composer Beethoven. Let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, Beethoven said that, Beethoven, like the Dalai Lama, believed that greatness basically depends on a person's heart. And Beethoven went on to say that he believed there was only really one way in which we could judge whether a person was superior to another person. And he said that was to judge them by the quality of their goodness. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."